Imagine a garden where birds wear musical instruments, fruit becomes architecture, and sinners are swallowed by hybrid beasts with the faces of cornets. Imagine a painter whose imagination seems to have stolen the language of dreams and nightmares and set it down in enamel bright detail. That painter is Hieronymus Bosch. His canvases are puzzles dressed as parables, seductive, grotesque, playful, and moral at once. For 500 years, people have leaned in, baffled and delighted, trying to read his strange visual shorthand. A man riding a fish, a church sprouting from a snail shell, an oversized fruit holding a couple in rapture. These are not random oddities. They are a private cosmology with a public aim: to warn, to amuse, to teach. Over the next 8.5 minutes, we'll walk through Bosch's life and work. The small facts we know, the enormous mysteries he painted, the techniques behind his uncanny detail, and the curious ways he reshaped European imagination. We'll look closely at the Garden of Earthly Delights, a centerpiece of paradox, at the Haywain, a moral caravan of folly, at the Ship of Fools, where vice is set to sail, at the Temptation of St. Anthony, stacked with monsters, and at the Extraction of the Stone of Madness, a comic surgical drama. When we say Bosch, we mean a world folded into a panel. Biographical sketch: Life in s-Hertogenbosch. Hieronymus Bosch was born around 1450, probably in the Dutch town whose name in Dutch, Hertogenbosch, he never left for long. He inherited his craft. Bosch came from a line of painters. His grandfather, father, and elder brother were named Hieronymus or Jan, sharing both a name and a workshop tradition. Records show him as a citizen and later a member of the Brotherhood of Our Lady, a lay religious confraternity, a clue to the devotional context that shaped his commissions. Unlike later celebrity artists, Bosch left no theoretical treatises, few personal letters, and a sketchy paper trail. He paid taxes, owned property, married, and ran a studio that likely produced retables and panels for local patrons. Curiosity: despite his fame now, during his lifetime, Bosch's name appears in municipal documents as much as in art inventories. He was a craftsman, a town figure, a neighbor, and, remarkably, a painter whose images offended and fascinated. That everyday rootedness, a hand in municipal affairs, a role in religious life, helps explain why his work speaks both to private fear and communal morality. Because we lack a portrait authenticated as his likeness, we must imagine the man through his panels. The same hand that drew a pilgrim on a road also drew devils in fine, almost microscopic strokes. Bosch's major works read like a bestiary of human weakness and invention. The Garden of Earthly Delights is his most famous, a monumental triptych whose left panel opens with Eden and its animals. Its center explodes into a multitude of nude figures amid impossible flora. Its right panel closes in on a nightmarish hell. Look at the central panel. Bodies mingle with oversized fruit and half-built structures. Actions are erotic, playful, yet rendered with a moral weight that tells you every pleasure might be freighted with consequence. The Haywain triptych compresses the same lesson into a moving caravan of greed. A large wagon piled with worldly goods rolls through a landscape of indifference, fools clinging to its sides. The Ship of Fools, a smaller panel often connected to the same moral universe, shows revelers adrift, a picture of communal folly. The Last Judgment and various renderings of the Temptation of St. Anthony show Bosch's range: apocalyptic visions, tormented saints, and commissioned altarpieces for devotional use. Stylistically, Bosch paints in the late Gothic and early Renaissance overlap. His figures retain a medieval stiffness, but are animated by an observational realism in faces and textures. His compositions are dense, often hierarchical. Narratives layer from quiet, left to right panels to crowded centers. Curiosity: art historians sometimes call him the first great modern surrealist, not because he came after Freud, but because he treated imagination as a rigorous tool, a language of symbols repeated and varied across panels. What turned Bosch from a competent local painter into a mythic visionary? Several moments matter. First, his workshop and family network gave him technical mastery and continuity. He could produce altarpieces and satisfy patrons while experimenting with odder visions on private panels. Second, his membership in devotional confraternities exposed him to sermons, moral literature, and popular piety, the material of his allegories. Third, the late 15th century was a time of social anxiety. Plague memory, corrupt clergy, pilgrimage culture, and an obsession with moral order. Bosch absorbed that anxiety and transformed it into imagery that tested the boundaries between sacred instruction and satirical bite. Works like The Temptation of St. Anthony and The Adoration of the Magi suggest he received commissions that required both orthodox iconography and inventive imagination. Curiosity. Some scholars argue that a few of Bosch's most eccentric images were intended less for churches than for private collectors who enjoyed theological puzzles. So what looks like pure moral instruction may have been an elite parlor game as much as a pulpit sermon. Bosch painted on oak panel using oil-based paints, pigments ground in oil to give luminous color and fine detail. He worked with a workshop, employing assistants and perhaps apprentices to prepare panels, gesso grounds, and underdrawings. Bosch's finishes vary. Sometimes fine, glazed passages create jewel-like color. Elsewhere, tiny strokes render fur, feathers, and hair with microscopic care. He used hatching and cross-hatching in paint to model forms and achieve depth through multiple glazed layers. A glazing technique is thin, translucent paint layers that modify what's beneath. Look closely at the extraction of the Stone of Madness, a surgical knife, a fool's crown, and a surgeon's expression, all rendered with crispness. The face is almost like carved wood. Bosch favored small brushes for detail, but could also lay down broader passages for landscape backgrounds. He planned compositions with underdrawing, preliminary sketches transferred to panel, sometimes visible in infrared examinations. Curiosity. Infrared and X-ray studies reveal pentimenti, changes Bosch made as he worked, showing an artist improvising, erasing, and refining, rather than slavishly following a blueprint. Curiosity. A few of his most famous motifs, like the bird-headed figures, may have begun as whimsical doodles that then became symbolic shorthand across works. Bosch's world is patterned by recurring themes: temptation and punishment, folly and wisdom, the body's appetites, and the soul's fate. Repeated motifs act like characters in his own theater: oversized fruit as sensual temptation, strange hybrid animals as moral agents, musical instruments as both pleasure and punishment, wheels, boats, and wagons as metaphors for movement toward doom or salvation. The Garden of Earthly Delights centers on human libido and transgression. The Ship of Fools critiques communal self-delusion. The Seven Deadly Sins series, roundels that explore each vice, reads as both catechism and satirical portrait gallery. Bosch loved paradox, humor and horror, amusement and admonition, often in the same brushstroke. Symbolism is slippery. A snail might mean cowardice one moment and mockery of the church the next, and that slipperiness is intentional. Curiosity, one famous image, the man with a funnel on his head, appears in several works. Scholars have read it as a symbol of futile learning, spiritual blockage, or simply a biting caricature of clerical folly. Curiosity, Bosch's devilish forms often recycle elements from everyday life: domestic tools, musical instruments, farming implements, turning the familiar into the uncanny. Bosch's reception has swung wildly. In his time, he was sought after. Patrons commissioned altarpieces and panels, yet his work also provoked debate. Some contemporaries found his grotesques indecorous, others praised the didactic clarity of his moral warnings. Centuries later, his name experienced a resurgence. Romantic poets and 19th century collectors read him as a genius of imagination. The modern era has cast him as proto-surrealist, while religious scholars have argued for strictly didactic readings. Controversy continues around attribution. Bosch's workshop produced copies and variants, and later copyists and imitators muddy the waters. Curiosity. For a long time, entire catalogs of Bosch's works were inflated with works by followers. Scientific analysis and stylistic study have helped pare the list, but debates remain. Curiosity. Some of his panels were deliberately cut into fragments and dispersed, making reconstruction a detective story that continues in museums and archives worldwide. Bosch's legacy is both direct and atmospheric. Directly, his compositions and inventions were copied by followers in the Low Countries and beyond. Later painters borrowed his iconography and adapted his monsters into new moral tales. Atmospherically, Bosch opened a door. He showed that moral painting could be imaginative and that allegory could be visually playful without losing bite. Modern artists and writers, from surrealists to graphic novelists, have cited him as a precursor. His visual logic anticipated 20th century experiments in dream imagery and symbolic montage. Museums today treat his panels as treasures of imagination, and exhibitions still draw crowds who want to be startled, puzzled, and instructed. Curiosity. Some 20th century psychoanalytic readings tried to map Bosch's monsters to individual neuroses. While that's speculative, it speaks to his work's uncanny ability to resonate with changing eras. Ultimately, Bosch is less a historical footnote and more an ongoing challenge: how to paint ethics with the uncanny. Sprinkled facts and small wonders. 1. Bosch's name, Hieronymus van Aken, appears in civic records. Bosch is likely a toponymic nickname tied to his hometown. 2. He used the same visual jokes repeatedly, a musician soaked in peculiarity here, a strange hybrid there, like a comedian with a repertoire. 3. Some of his panels were made to be closed and opened like altarpieces. Their outer wings often carry moralizing images that frame an inner spectacle of sin or salvation. 4. A single detail, say a tiny knife or a musical reed, can function as a psychological key across several works, a private motif that rewards close looking. 5. Scientific imaging has discovered that Bosch sometimes reused panels, scraping away earlier scenes to paint anew, a literal palimpsest of imagination. These curiosities are not idle trivia. They are windows into a workshop, a mind, and a society negotiating fear and desire. So what is Bosch to us now? He is a moralist with a comic streak, a dreamer with a craftsman's hand, a town painter whose scenes now loom like myth. His paintings ask us to look closer, to read contradictions, to accept that delight and dread can occupy the same frame. In a garden of earthly delights, we recognize our own appetite for spectacle. In a Haywain, our tendency to haul treasure that turns out to be a burden. The true miracle is that his images continue to feel urgent. They are maps of temptation that do not feel dated, because temptation is a perennial subject. Bosch's work is a conversation across centuries, an invitation to puzzle and to be corrected, to laugh and to shiver. As you leave this portrait in audio, picture his panels one last time, crowded with action, saturated with symbolism, impossible to reduce to a single meaning. The final lesson he offers is both simple and unsettling. Look and be changed.